They asked her to leave without an explanation, but Karoline wasn't about to let that slide. Here's what happened next. Karoline sat at her usual corner booth at the Oak Room, the local bistro she had frequented for years. It wasn't just any restaurant. It was her sanctuary, the place she could always count on for comfort and familiarity. It was the kind of place where the waiters knew your name, where the manager stopped by to ask how you were doing. She loved it here. The day started like any other. She had just finished a meeting, and this was the perfect spot to unwind. The aroma of freshly baked bread wafted through the air, mixing with the sounds of clinking glasses and quiet conversations. Caroline had a table by the window, the one with the best view of the street. She could always spot the changes in the neighborhood from here, the construction projects, the new businesses opening, the occasional parade down Main Street. As she scanned the menu, her mind still racing from the morning's events, she noticed a new face among the staff, a tall, middle-aged man with a clean-shaven face and a sharp suit. She'd never seen him before, but it didn't seem unusual. New hires were common enough. When the waiter came over, Caroline ordered her usual, grilled salmon with a side of roasted vegetables. She smiled, already anticipating the meal. But before the waiter could leave, the new man walked over to the table. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but firm. Caroline looked up, confused. "Yes? I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the man said, his tone blunt. Caroline's brow furrowed. "Pardon me?" she asked, leaning forward slightly, thinking she had misheard him. "You need to leave. Now," he said again, more insistent this time. The man didn't seem angry, but there was no mistaking the urgency in his voice. He was standing just a little too close, his body language stiff. It was as if he was waiting for her to argue, to cause a scene. But Caroline wasn't the type. She looked around the restaurant, seeing the other diners steal glances in her direction. No one was saying anything, but they were watching. She felt a brief flash of confusion, but it was quickly replaced by a calm clarity. Caroline had been in uncomfortable situations before, but something about this felt off. She didn't know what was happening, but it didn't sit right with her. "Can you tell me why?" she asked, her voice steady and polite, though her heart rate had definitely picked up. The man paused, and for a moment it seemed like he might back off. Instead, he stood there, hands clasped in front of him, his eyes cold. "I don't need to explain," he replied curtly. Caroline could feel her pulse quickening, but she didn't let her emotions show. She had seen enough to know that sometimes people had power trips, that some folks thought they could just push others around for no reason. She wasn't about to let that happen today. Not here, not to her. "Actually, I think you do," Caroline said, her voice still calm but now carrying a note of authority. "I've been coming here for years, and I've never been treated like this. If you're going to ask me to leave, I deserve an explanation, just like any other customer would." There was a pause. The man's lips pressed into a thin line. He looked over his shoulder at the manager, who was standing near the kitchen door, watching them closely. The manager made no move to intervene. That was strange. Caroline had always seen the manager around, chatting with customers, making sure everyone was comfortable. Why wasn't he stepping in now? She could feel her frustration building, but she held it back. She wasn't about to escalate things unnecessarily, but it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the principle of the situation. The man looked back at her, as though deciding what to say next. Finally, he spoke. "You're disturbing the other customers," he said, though the words lacked conviction. Caroline raised an eyebrow, surprised by the weak excuse. "Disturbing?" she repeated, glancing around the room. Everyone seemed to be minding their own business, chatting quietly or sipping their drinks. There was no commotion, no uproar. "This is a public place," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "I'm just here for a meal. I'm not disturbing anyone." But the more she spoke, the more she realized that the situation wasn't as simple as it appeared. There was something else going on here. She had to know what it was. What had happened? Why was she suddenly being asked to leave without any explanation? She looked the man in the eye. "I'll leave, but only when I understand why you're asking me to go. I think that's only fair." The manager had yet to move, still standing in the doorway, staring at them both. Caroline could feel his gaze burning into her, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't going anywhere, until she had the answer she needed. This wasn't just about her, it was about respect. And she wasn't going to let this man walk all over her without a fight. But would she get the explanation she was looking for? Or was this going to be a fight she never saw coming? Karoline stood her ground, the quiet murmur of the restaurant around her providing an oddly soothing backdrop to the escalating tension. She had never been the type to back down from a challenge, but this felt different. The man in front of her wasn't giving her any real reason for his actions, and the manager still hadn't intervened. It was as if he was waiting for something, or perhaps he was hoping she would just leave without making a scene. The more she thought about it, the more frustrated she became. This wasn't about the meal. It was about being treated with respect. She had been a loyal customer for years, and here she was, being asked to leave for no reason. She wasn't going to let this slide. The man's posture remained rigid, as though he was still preparing for her to argue. His eyes flickered between her and the manager, who hadn't moved from his spot by the kitchen door. Karoline noticed the slight tension in the air, the way everyone in the restaurant seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. She couldn't help but wonder what was really going on here. Why was she being singled out like this? It didn't make sense. And the longer the silence stretched, the more she realized that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Someone had made a decision about her that she didn't even know about. "You haven't given me a reason," Karoline said again, her voice unwavering. The man's jaw clenched. He looked over at the manager once more, who had finally started to walk toward them. There was a flash of something, annoyance, across the manager's face, but he said nothing as he approached. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the manager finally said, his tone uncomfortably neutral. "We've had a complaint about you." Karoline blinked, taken aback. A complaint? About me? Her mind raced. She couldn't remember doing anything that would warrant a complaint. She'd always been polite, never causing a scene. What kind of complaint? The manager hesitated. "I'm afraid I can't disclose that information," he said, his voice stiff. Karoline felt a surge of disbelief. "You're telling me that you're going to ask me to leave over something I don't even know about?" The man standing next to her didn't say anything, but his posture stiffened further. It was clear that the situation was becoming uncomfortable for him too. But Karoline didn't care about making him uncomfortable. She cared about getting the truth. "I don't think this is right," Karoline said firmly, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't just talking to the manager anymore. She was speaking to everyone around her. "I've been coming here for years. I've never caused any problems. If someone has an issue with me, I deserve to know what it is." The manager's eyes flickered, and Karoline could see the hint of a struggle on his face. For a brief moment, it seemed like he was considering backing down. But instead, he sighed, then cleared his throat and stuck to his position. "I'm sorry, but I've been instructed to ask you to leave," he said, his tone losing its earlier edge, now sounding more apologetic. Karoline took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. She could feel her pulse rising, but she refused to let her emotions take control. She wasn't just going to walk out without understanding why this was happening. She turned her gaze back to the man beside her, her voice low but firm. "I'm not leaving until I get an explanation. I've been a loyal customer here, and I won't be treated this way without knowing why." For a moment it looked like the man might argue, but instead, he just shook his head slightly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. The manager, too, seemed to be caught between wanting to handle this quickly and realizing that Karoline wasn't going to back down. "Listen," Karoline said, her tone softening just a little. "I'm not trying to cause any trouble. I just want to understand what's going on. If there's a legitimate reason for me to leave, I'll go. But I deserve to know what it is." The manager looked at her, then back at the man. There was a moment of hesitation before he finally spoke. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he repeated. "It's just protocol." Karoline raised an eyebrow. "Protocol?" she echoed, the word hanging in the air. "What protocol?" "I've been coming here for years. This place has always been welcoming. What's changed?" The man and the manager exchanged an unreadable look. It was as if they were both waiting for something, maybe for Karoline to break, maybe for her to leave without asking more questions. But she wasn't about to do that, not now. The silence stretched, and for a moment, Karoline thought she might be getting nowhere. But then something shifted.